You are here tonight because money weighs heavy on your mind. You want peace, you want clarity, and you want to know the lessons from the past that can guide your future. This story of the Great Depression is more than history. It is a guide that shows you what happens when systems fail, how people survive, and what we can learn to protect ourselves today. This video will walk you through the Great Depression step by step. You will see how the crash began. You will understand why banks failed. You will learn how families lived with less and still found ways to support each other. You will follow the government's response and what changed forever because of it. By the end, you will carry lessons that still matter for your own money choices right now. You will hear about jobs lost in a single day. You will see how a paycheck disappeared and what it meant for a family. You will learn how people stood in breadlines and traded work for food. You will see how rules like deposit insurance came from pain and why they matter to you today. These lessons will give you practical clarity. They will help you see that financial struggles are not new and that survival is possible. This story will also show you the human side. You will understand the stress parents felt when their children went to bed hungry. You will hear about the silence of locked banks and the sound of empty factories. You will learn how shame and fear shaped a generation's money habits. And you will see how those same emotions still shape the way many of us think about savings, debt, and security today. Why should you stay until the end of this video? Because each chapter adds another piece to the picture. The early parts explain the mistakes that caused the crash. The middle parts reveal the daily life of struggle and survival. The later parts show the solutions, the policies, and the lessons that came out of hardship. If you leave early, you will miss the full arc. If you stay, you will end with knowledge that can calm your own money fears. You will see that the Great Depression is not just a story of loss, it is also a story of resilience. By staying through to the final chapter, you will hear about the rituals families built to cope. You will learn how small daily actions gave them strength, and you will see how those same habits can help you calm your own financial stress today. The story is long because the lessons are deep. By the end, you will not only understand what happened, but also why it matters. You will see the connection between 1929 and your own bank account. You will understand why government programs like Social Security and the FDIC exist. You will know how inflation, unemployment, and market crashes are not abstract ideas, but lived experiences that shaped millions of lives. The value of listening until the end is this: you will walk away with both knowledge and peace. Knowledge, because you will know what really happened and how people adapted. Peace, because you will see that financial hardship is survivable and that fear can be softened with understanding. History is not here to scare you. It is here to comfort you by showing that struggle is shared and recovery is possible. This is not a quick lesson or a short summary. This is a full story, told gently and slowly, so you can absorb it without pressure. Every chapter will bring you closer to the truth of how people faced their hardest financial season and what you can take from their experience. If you stay with me, you will sleep tonight with more clarity and wake with more calm around money. So let us begin. The Great Depression started with a crash that seemed sudden, but had been building for years. The next chapter will show you how a single week in October 1929 broke the illusion of endless wealth and began the hardest financial story of the 20th century. It started softly. The 1920s looked like an age of endless growth. Factories hummed. Radios filled homes with music. Families felt richer than before. The country seemed strong and unstoppable, but underneath the shine, cracks were already forming. People bought more than they could afford. They used borrowed money to buy stocks. It felt easy and safe, but it was not. Debt grew while savings stayed thin. At the dinner table, fathers boasted about shares rising. Children heard words like profits and gains. Mothers clipped articles about the stock market boom. Paper wealth felt as good as real money. The whole nation trusted the staircase would rise forever. Banks encouraged this belief. They handed out loans without enough caution. They acted like tomorrow would always repay today. Speculation spread to every town and street. Everyone wanted in. Nobody questioned the risk. Factories made too much. People bought too little. The system tipped out of balance. But most families did not see the warning. They kept dreaming about more. Then came October 1929. The market first dipped slightly. Investors grew nervous but kept waiting. Within days, fear turned into panic. By October 29th, the illusion collapsed. On Black Tuesday, billions vanished in hours. Crowds gathered outside Wall Street, silent and shocked. Stocks became worthless slips of paper. Rich and poor alike faced ruin. The country entered a long night. For families at home, the crash felt personal. Parents stared at numbers that meant nothing now. Weddings were postponed. Groceries felt uncertain. Mortgage payments slipped out of reach. Dreams folded into fear. The panic spread to banks next. People rushed to withdraw their savings. Lines stretched down city blocks, but vaults had little inside. When money ran out, doors locked shut. A bank run was the name given. But to families, it felt like betrayal. They had trusted their life's work to institutions. Now it was gone without a trace. Hope shrank each time a teller said no. At night, fear became sharper. Children slept, but parents stayed awake. They worried about tomorrow's bread. They whispered about unpaid rent. The silence in kitchens grew heavy. The crash taught harsh lessons. Paper wealth is not real security. Banks without protection collapse under fear. When trust is broken, panic spreads quickly, and rebuilding takes longer than losing. Yet, even in collapse, people reached for each other. Neighbors left food on doorsteps. Farmers shared crops they could not sell. Communities built quiet networks of care. Kindness replaced coins when nothing else worked. Children remembered these acts for life. They grew cautious with money as adults. They saved even small amounts tightly. They avoided debt whenever possible. Scarcity shaped their habits forever. The crash was not only numbers, it was shame, fear, and broken trust. It was fathers who stopped talking at the table. It was mothers who skipped meals for children. It was a generation shaped by silence. The fear reached every corner. Factories closed, shops emptied, unemployment soared within months. People searched for jobs that no longer existed. The economy turned into dust. Still, resilience appeared quietly. Soup kitchens opened in cities. Churches held food drives. Neighbors shared blankets and coal. Survival became a collective effort. History shows us how fragile money is, but it also shows how strong people are. Even when banks failed, people adapted. Even when jobs vanished, survival continued. Resilience became the currency of the time. The crash is remembered for numbers, but its real impact was trust. People learned that wealth could vanish overnight. They learned that no system is permanent, and they carried that truth forward forever. Parents whispered the same thought at night. If this happened once, could it happen again? That question lingered across decades. It shaped policies and protections. It shaped families and their choices. This first chapter is only the beginning. The crash opened the door to years of struggle. The next part of the story lies in survival. We turn now to the breadlines, where hunger and hope stood side by side. In cities and towns, paychecks disappeared almost overnight. Factories closed, shops shut their doors, and farms could not sell crops. It was not only numbers on paper that were gone, it was meals, warmth, and the feeling of safety. In the cold mornings, men in worn coats lined up outside soup kitchens. Some carried tin cups, others held small bowls from home. They waited quietly, sometimes for hours, just to be handed bread and a ladle of thin soup. These lines stretched around corners. They were called breadlines, but for many, they were lifelines. Hunger became part of daily life. Children felt it most. Their stomachs ached at night, and their mothers stretched what little food they had into soups watered down to last longer. Some families boiled vegetables until the broth was nearly clear, then poured it into small cups so each child had at least something warm. Parents often skipped meals so their children could eat first. For men and women who had worked all their lives, standing in a breadline carried shame. Pride kept some away even when they needed it most. Mothers feared neighbors, whispering about their struggles. Hunger was not only physical, it carried the weight of judgment. But the truth was simple. No one in those lines stood alone. Farmers, clerks, factory workers, teachers, and veterans all found themselves side by side. Each carried the same quiet fear. Soup kitchens became centers of survival. Some were run by charities, churches, or small groups of volunteers. A few were supported by local governments. The kindness of strangers became as important as the food itself. Children grew up with these memories. They learned to be grateful for even the smallest piece of bread. They learned that food was precious and waste was unthinkable. These lessons stayed with them into adulthood, shaping how they treated money and how carefully they planned meals for their own children years later. Hunger also changed how communities worked together. Neighbors started sharing gardens. Families traded what they had for what they lacked. If one family had flour, another might trade eggs or milk. If someone had extra blankets, they were lent to a neighbor with none. These small acts formed an invisible network of survival that stretched across entire neighborhoods. For those without homes, the struggle was harsher. Many traveled from town to town looking for food or work. Some built makeshift camps near cities called Hooverville. In these camps, people built shacks from scrap wood, cardboard, and tin. They cooked meals over fires made from broken boards. Life there was rough, but even in those places, people shared what little they had. The breadline became a symbol of the Depression. It showed the gap between the promise of prosperity and the reality of collapse. A decade earlier, people had believed in endless growth. The contrast was sharp, and it marked an entire generation. Children watching their parents in breadlines carried invisible scars. Some grew up fearful of being poor again. They saved every penny they earned later in life. They refused to take risks with money. Others grew cautious with food, storing cans and jars in their homes long after the Depression ended. The memory of hunger never fully left them. Yet there was also resilience. Families invented new ways to stretch what little they had. Old clothes were patched again and again. Soup bones were boiled for days until no flavor was left. These small adjustments showed that survival was possible, even when nothing seemed certain. Some families planted small gardens called relief gardens. These plots provided vegetables to feed them through the summer and into winter. Cities encouraged this, turning empty lots into places where families could grow food together. The gardens brought more than nutrition. They gave people a sense of control in a time when so much felt lost. The breadline also carried quiet dignity. Though many felt shame, there was also community in those lines. People shared stories. They comforted one another. They stood together through wind, snow, and rain. Waiting became a ritual of endurance, a way to say, "We are still here." Looking back, historians often describe the breadline as a symbol of despair. But for the people who stood there, it was more than that. It was survival. It was a chance to live one more day, to keep going, and to wait for change. The bread handed out in those lines carried more than calories. It carried hope. These years taught families lessons that still echo today. They learned to save when they could. They learned not to waste. They learned that asking for help is not weakness, but survival. They learned that dignity does not disappear in hardship, even if pride feels wounded. These lessons shaped how they viewed money and security for the rest of their lives. The breadline dream, as some later called it, was not about bread itself. It was about the dream of a return to stability. Each person who stood in line dreamed of a job, a paycheck, and the chance to provide for their family again. Bread filled the stomach, but hope kept people alive inside. The Depression years showed that when systems fail, people still find ways to endure. Hunger is harsh, but kindness softens it. Pride bends, but dignity survives. The breadline was proof that even in the hardest times, people can carry each other forward. As families walked home with their bread and soup, the question lingered. Would tomorrow bring food again, or would the line grow longer? This uncertainty weighed heavy, but it also built patience and strength. It taught people to wait, to endure, and to hold on to hope even when answers felt far away. The breadline tells us something important about money and survival. Money provides choice and freedom, but when it disappears, survival still depends on community. People who had nothing still shared what little they had. That truth remains powerful today. As the line stretched on and the winters grew colder, families searched for new ways to keep going. Bread filled one need, but shelter was another. Many lost their homes as they lost their jobs. Some traveled in search of work, carrying their belongings on their backs. Some built shacks from scraps, forming communities on the edges of cities. Life in these shantytowns brought a new chapter in the struggle. That is where our story turns next. From breadlines to Hoovervilles, the struggle for food became the struggle for shelter. And with shelter came the question of dignity, identity, and what it means to call a place home. Breadlines filled empty stomachs, but another need pressed harder each day. Families without money for rent lost their homes. Farmers who could not sell crops lost their land. The crash of the market had turned quickly into the collapse of security. Hunger was only part of the struggle. Finding a place to sleep became its own daily battle. Across the country, shantytowns rose up near cities. These were makeshift settlements built from whatever scraps people could find. Wood from broken fences, cardboard from packing crates, tin from old metal sheets. Families pieced together walls and roofs, patching holes with cloth or paper. Fires burned in barrels at night to provide warmth. These places became known as Hoovervilles. The name carried bitterness. People blamed President Hoover for not doing enough to help. Calling the shantytowns Hoovervilles was a way to point to leadership that felt distant and unresponsive. Families joked darkly about Hoover blankets, which were worn-out newspapers used as covers at night. They called empty pockets Hoover flags. These words carried humor, but they also carried pain. Life in Hoovervilles was harsh. Rain leaked through roofs. Cold winds cut through thin walls. In summer, the heat trapped itself inside the small shacks. Families slept on the ground, on piles of rags, or on thin mattresses found in trash heaps. Illness spread quickly where sanitation was poor. Children grew up in these camps with little privacy, little comfort, and constant uncertainty. Still, communities formed. Families built their shacks close together. They shared fires, traded food, and kept watch over each other. If someone managed to find a bit of extra work, they often shared their wages with neighbors in need. Hoovervilles were places of desperation, but they also carried quiet networks of support. In a world where so much was broken, people tried to hold one another together. Jobs were scarce, and many men traveled from camp to camp, searching for work. Some hopped trains, carrying only a small bag, and hoped for wages in another city. Others stood at factory gates each morning, hoping to be chosen for a day's labor. The line between survival and despair grew thin. Families in Hoovervilles clung to any chance for income, no matter how small. Children often carried the weight of these struggles. They went barefoot through mud and dust. They learned quickly to make toys from sticks and scraps. School was often impossible, since families moved so often and many towns could not afford to keep teachers. A generation grew up knowing more about hardship than childhood. Their memories became a lasting imprint on how they viewed money, safety, and work in later years. The shantytowns also faced hostility. Some city leaders saw them as dangerous ice wars. Police tore down camps, leaving families to scatter and rebuild elsewhere. Yet for those living there, Hoovervilles were not choices of laziness. They were the only option left when rent was unpaid and landlords closed their doors. They were symbols of both failure and survival. People in Hoovervilles created their own small systems of order. Leaders rose in each camp to settle disputes. Families set rules about shared fires or shared wells. Some camps even held makeshift churches or meeting spaces. In the middle of struggle, people still sought dignity, order, and community. The image of Hoovervilles spread through newspapers and photographs. America could no longer look away from the sight of thousands living in shacks by railroad tracks or under bridges. These images captured the human cost of the Depression. They showed that poverty was not a distant problem. It was real, present, and widespread. The lessons from Hoovervilles echo strongly today. They show how fragile housing security can be when income disappears. They show how quickly ordinary families can fall from stability into survival mode. And they show how dignity survives even in the harshest places, through shared effort and community strength. Some families eventually left Hoovervilles when they found steady work again. Others remained for years, moving from camp to camp as conditions changed. Many children who grew up in these places carried the memory of cardboard walls and firelight shadows long into adulthood. Those memories shaped their habits, their fears, and their drive to hold on to any form of stability once they grew older. Hoovervilles were painful symbols, but they were also powerful reminders. They revealed the limits of leadership and the strength of ordinary people. They showed that survival was not about comfort, but about community, patience, and hope. Even in shacks built from scraps, families dreamed of a better tomorrow. As nights stretched long and cold in those camps, people whispered questions that still matter today. What does it mean to feel secure? What does it mean to truly have a home? For many, the answer was simple. A home was not walls or a roof. It was the presence of family and the shared effort to endure. The fight for shelter did not end with Hoovervilles. As the Depression deepened, protests grew louder. Veterans marched on Washington demanding support. Families petitioned local governments for relief. The struggle for dignity turned into a movement for change. These voices began to shift the national conversation, pressing leaders to act. That shift is where the story moves next. From shantytowns to government halls, the call for relief became louder than ever. Policies and programs began to rise, built from the cries of families in breadlines and the shadows of Hoovervilles. The breadlines filled bellies, and the Hoovervilles sheltered bodies. But something deeper began to grow. Families who had once stayed silent started to raise their voices. The struggle for food and shelter could not remain hidden. The country could no longer pretend that people would endure without help. Out of hunger and cold, protest was born. Men and women who had never marched before began to walk together in streets. They carried signs asking for bread, for jobs, for dignity. Some protests were quiet, with families gathered in parks, holding banners with careful words. Others grew tense when police faced crowds that refused to leave. Each protest carried the same message. Survival was not enough. People wanted change. One of the most powerful protests came from veterans. These were men who had fought in World War I and returned home years earlier with the promise of a bonus for their service. That bonus was meant to be paid in the 1940s, but the Depression made waiting impossible. Hungry and desperate, they asked for their money early. They became known as the Bonus Army. In 1932, thousands of veterans and their families marched to Washington. D.C. They built camps on the edges of the city, tents and shacks similar to the Hoovervilles scattered across the country. They waited there for Congress to decide. They asked simply for what was already owed to them. They wanted the means to buy food, pay rent, and survive. For weeks, the Bonus Army stayed in Washington. Families lived in their camps while veterans lobbied lawmakers. But when Congress rejected the bill to pay the bonus early, anger spread. The veterans refused to leave quietly. They had risked their lives for the nation, and now they risked their dignity to demand relief. Their presence became a symbol of the nation's broken promise. The government's response was harsh. Police, and later the military, were sent to clear the camps. Shacks were burned. Families were forced to flee. The sight of soldiers driving out veterans shocked the public. Newspapers captured images of men in uniform standing against men who had once worn the same uniform. Trust in leadership fell even lower. The Bonus Army March was one of many protests during the Depression. Across the country, workers went on strike, demanding fair wages and shorter hours. Farmers blocked roads to stop food from being shipped. When prices were too low to cover their costs, families organized at the local level, asking for relief programs and government action. Each act of protest added to the pressure on leaders to respond. For many Americans, protest was not a choice. It was a last option. When jobs vanished, when banks closed, when homes were lost, silence no longer protected anyone. Speaking out felt risky, but silence meant hunger. People gathered not out of anger alone, but out of necessity. They needed to be heard. The Depression taught families that their voices mattered, even when they felt powerless. Each protest carried the weight of survival. Each march told leaders that the country could not continue on the same path. And while protests did not always win immediate relief, they kept the nation's attention on the struggles that could not be ignored. Children growing up in these years watched their parents march. They saw their fathers hold signs and their mothers walk in lines of protest. They learned that speaking up was sometimes the only way to be seen. These lessons shaped how a generation thought about fairness, government, and responsibility. The protests also revealed the tension between pride and survival. Many who marched had once believed they would never need to ask for help. They had worked hard, trusted the system, and expected stability. But when the system failed, they chose to stand together instead of staying silent. That choice showed that dignity is not lost in asking. It is found in demanding fairness. The Bonus Army was remembered long after their camps were cleared. Their struggle highlighted the gap between the promises of government and the needs of the people. It revealed how far leaders were willing to go to protect appearances instead of addressing suffering. And it planted seeds for later reforms that would give veterans greater support in the years to come. Protest during the Depression was not only about food or wages, it was about recognition. It was about the right to live with dignity even in the hardest times. It was about refusing to disappear into silence. The voices of the hungry and homeless carried a weight that could not be ignored forever. The pressure of these voices built slowly, and eventually, the response came. Political leadership began to change. New policies were considered. Relief programs began to form. The voices of protest became the foundation for action. Without those cries, the changes might never have arrived. Looking back, the protests remind us that hardship is not only endured, it is also resisted. People in breadlines, Hoovervilles, and marches showed that survival includes speaking out. The Depression was a season of pain, but it was also a season of courage. Ordinary people found strength in unity, and that strength forced the nation to face reality. As nights passed in shacks and days stretched in marches, one question grew louder. Would leadership finally listen? Would there be real solutions, or only more silence? The country waited, caught between despair and the hope of change. That is where our story turns next. Out of protest and demand, new leaders rose and new programs were born. The government began to shape responses that would alter the nation forever. Relief, reform, and recovery became the words of a new chapter in history. The voices of protest could not be ignored forever. People in breadlines, in Hoovervilles, and in marches showed the country their pain. Leaders could no longer pretend survival alone was enough. Change had to come, and when Franklin D. Roosevelt stepped into office in 1933, he promised a new beginning. He called it the New Deal. The New Deal was not one single program. It was a collection of actions designed to bring relief, create jobs, and rebuild trust. Roosevelt understood that people needed hope as much as they needed bread. His calm voice on the radio, called the Fireside Chats, spoke directly to families in their homes. He told them that government would no longer sit still. It would act. Relief programs came first. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration sent money to states to support families in crisis. For many, this meant the difference between an empty table and a simple meal. The Civilian Conservation Corps gave young men work building parks, planting trees, and repairing roads. These jobs did not only provide wages, they gave dignity back to those who had been idle for too long. The Works Progress Administration soon followed. It created millions of jobs across the country. Men built bridges, schools, and hospitals. Women worked in sewing rooms, libraries, and food programs. The WPA even supported artists, writers, and musicians, proving that creativity also had value in rebuilding a nation. For families, the WPA meant paychecks again, and with paychecks came food and shelter. Banking reforms were another cornerstone. After years of fear, Roosevelt declared a bank holiday to stop the collapse. During that time, the government inspected banks and reopened only those that were stable. To rebuild trust, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was created. For the first time, families were promised that their savings were safe up to a certain amount. The memory of bank runs began to fade, replaced by a small but vital sense of security. Farms also received attention. Prices for crops had fallen so low that farmers could not survive. The Agricultural Adjustment Act aimed to balance production and raise prices. It was painful at times because farmers were paid to plant less or destroy surplus crops. But the goal was to make farming sustainable again, and for many rural families, this relief was life-saving. The New Deal reshaped how people saw government. Before, many believed the government should stay distant from daily life. Now it stepped directly into homes, workplaces, and farms. It was not perfect. Some programs helped more than others. Some left out groups like Black families, immigrant workers, or women in need. But overall, the New Deal showed that leadership was listening at last. For families, the change was immediate. Fathers returned to work sites. Mothers saw food return to cupboards. Children heard laughter again at dinner tables, even if meals were still modest. Radio broadcasts carried Roosevelt's steady tone into living rooms, easing fear. Hope, though fragile, began to grow. The New Deal also planted seeds for long-term change. Social Security was created, giving older Americans a safety net for the first time. Labor laws strengthened workers' rights, setting standards for fair wages and safer conditions. The Securities and Exchange Commission was formed to regulate the stock market, aiming to prevent the reckless speculation that had led to the crash. These changes shaped the nation for decades to come. Still, the New Deal was not magic. Unemployment remained high for years. many families continued to struggle. But the difference was clear. There was now a path forward, a hand reaching out instead of turning away. People no longer felt entirely alone in their fight. Children growing up during the New Deal saw their parents work again. They watched communities rebuild schools and roads. They felt the relief of stability returning, even in small ways. These experiences shaped how they valued work, government, and security for the rest of their lives. The New Deal was also a story of faith. People had to trust again after years of disappointment. Trust in banks, in jobs, in leaders, and in the idea that the future could still hold promise. That trust was not easy. It had been broken before. But step by step, through programs and paychecks, it was slowly rebuilt. Looking back, the New Deal showed that government could be more than distant rules. It could act as a partner in survival. It could build safety nets to catch families before they fell too far. It could restore dignity when dignity had been stripped away. Families who once stood in breadlines now stood at work sites. Those who once slept in Hoovervilles now saw the chance for proper homes again. The wounds of the Depression did not heal overnight, but the New Deal stitched the first threads of recovery. The Depression still continued, and the struggles were not over, but a new chapter had begun. The people who once felt forgotten now felt seen. The voices of protest had turned into programs of action, and the nation had started to learn that shared struggle required shared solutions. As the New Deal spread across the country, one question remained. Would it be enough to fully end the Depression, or would more sacrifices still lie ahead? Families held on to hope, but they also braced themselves for the next challenge. That is where our story moves next. The New Deal gave structure, but life in the Depression still demanded hard choices. Families had to adjust their habits, their spending, and their daily lives. And those lessons, born from hardship, would last for generations. The New Deal brought programs and promises, but daily life for families still carried struggle. Even with new jobs and relief, many households lived with less than they ever had before. Every choice mattered. Every penny mattered. Each day was a test of how to stretch what little was available. Meals were simple. Families cooked with whatever ingredients they could afford. Meat became rare. Bread, beans, and potatoes filled most plates. Mothers learned to make soups that lasted for days, adding water to stretch portions. Children often ate the same meals again and again. Variety was not common, but survival was steady. Clothing was patched until fabric wore thin. Old shirts became quilts. Dresses were shortened and remade for younger children. Shoes were repaired with cardboard when soles wore out. Families shared coats, passing them down from older to younger siblings. Nothing was thrown away if it could be fixed, reused, or reshaped into something else. Work, when available, shaped the rhythm of days. Men left early for jobs through the WPA or other relief programs. Women often took sewing, laundry, or cooking work for neighbors. Some sold baked bread or mended clothes for extra income. Every coin earned went toward the same simple goals: rent, food, and heat. Children carried their own burdens. Many left school to help at home. They worked in fields, in small shops, or selling newspapers on corners. For some, school attendance dropped not because of choice, but because shoes wore out and parents could not replace them. Education became a privilege, not a guarantee. Entertainment was scarce, yet people still found joy. Radios became central in living rooms, carrying music, news, and Roosevelt's calming voice. Families gathered around the soft glow of the dial, listening to stories and programs that distracted them from hunger or worry. Children played games with marbles, sticks, or simple homemade toys. Neighbors visited each other to share laughter even when resources were thin. Churches and community halls became centers of connection. They offered not only charity, but also companionship. People needed places to gather, to feel less alone. Singing hymns, sharing small meals, or joining in community projects helped restore dignity. In hardship, people leaned on each other. Winter was the hardest season. Coal was expensive. Families often huddled together in one room to stay warm. Blankets were shared, and fires burned low to make fuel last longer. The cold tested spirits, but families endured by holding close and reminding each other that spring would return. Health was another challenge. Doctor visits were often too costly. Families relied on home remedies or community advice. Illness lingered longer when medicine was out of reach. Many children grew underweight, and diseases spread easily in crowded neighborhoods and camps. Even so, resilience grew alongside hardship. Families did what they could with what they had. The Depression shaped how people thought about waste. Food scraps were saved for soups. Old jars became storage containers. String was rolled into balls to be used again. These habits lasted long after the Depression ended. Many who grew up in those years carried the belief that nothing should be wasted for the rest of their lives. Joy was not absent. Weddings still took place, though often smaller and simpler. Babies were born, families grew, and celebrations happened with whatever resources were available. Music still played in homes, even if it came from a single radio or a neighbor's harmonica. Life did not stop, it adjusted. Daily life in the Depression was about balance. Families balanced fear with hope. They balanced hunger with kindness. They balanced loss with small acts of endurance. Each day felt long, but each day survived was another step forward. The lessons of those years shaped entire generations. Children who grew up with scarcity learned to save, to plan, and to avoid debt. Parents who lived through layoffs taught their children the value of steady work. Families passed down stories of survival, reminding future generations of the strength they carried when times were hardest. Daily life in the Depression reminds us that survival is not only about money. It is about community, resilience, and patience. It is about finding joy in small things and meaning in shared struggle. These truths gave people strength then, and they still offer comfort today. Yet even as families adjusted, the bigger picture loomed. Jobs were still scarce. Farms faced deep struggles. Entire regions of the country would soon face a new disaster, one that would make hunger and hardship even harder. In the Great Plains, dust would rise and turn the sky dark. Families who had endured the crash and the breadlines would now face storms of Earth itself. That is where our story turns next. Beyond the daily struggles of city and town, the Dust Bowl would add a new layer of crisis. It would test not only survival, but also the will to stay or leave. While cities struggled with breadlines and families patched clothes, another disaster began far from Wall Street. On the Great Plains, farmers faced a crisis that no government program could stop. It was not banks or stock markets this time. It was the land itself. The Dust Bowl became one of the harshest trials of the Great Depression, turning farms into deserts and families into wanderers. The Great Plains had always been difficult to farm. Rain was never guaranteed, but during the 1920s, years of good weather gave farmers confidence. They plowed more land than ever before, planting wheat across millions of acres. The soil seemed endless. But when drought came in the early 1930s, the truth revealed itself. The land had been pushed too far. Without rain, crops withered. Without roots to hold it, the soil loosened. Then the winds arrived. They swept across the plains, lifting the dry earth into the air. Dust storms rolled like waves, blackening skies, blotting out the sun. Farmers called them black blizzards. Dust seeped into homes, covered furniture, and filled lungs. Life in these regions became unbearable. Families tried to endure at first. They sealed windows with rags. They stuffed cracks in doors with wet cloth. Mothers swept dust from tables only to see it return within minutes. Children coughed through the night. Livestock starved when grass vanished beneath layers of dirt. The land that once promised abundance now offered nothing but storms. The economic pain deepened. Farmers could not sell crops that did not grow. Many lost their land when they could not pay debts. Tractors and plows were repossessed. Barns stood empty. Families who had worked the soil for generations faced the hardest choice of all: stay and starve, or leave and search for a future elsewhere. For many, leaving became the only choice. Thousands of families packed what they could onto trucks and wagons. They tied mattresses to roofs, loaded pots and pans, and carried children on laps. They became migrants, heading west to California and other states, hoping to find work in fields and orchards. These journeys were long, uncertain, and filled with hardship. The road west was not easy. Cars broke down in desert heat. Families camped by roadsides, cooking meals over small fires. Money ran out quickly, forcing people to sell belongings along the way. Yet hope pushed them forward. Stories spread of fertile land in California, of jobs in fruit orchards, of a place where the dust did not choke the sky. When they arrived, the truth was harder. Jobs were scarce and wages were low. Migrant camps filled with families from the plains, tents and shacks crowded together. Locals often saw migrants as outsiders, calling them names and blaming them for problems. Work in the fields was exhausting, and pay barely kept families alive. Yet for many, even this was better than the dust. Children who made the journey west carried memories of dust storms that turned day into night. They remembered parents coughing, animals dying, and the sound of wind pounding walls for hours without rest. These experiences left deep marks, teaching them caution and resilience. They grew into adults who feared waste and valued every drop of water, every bite of food. The Dust Bowl revealed how closely survival is tied to the land. It showed that farming without care can bring long-term costs. It taught the importance of balance, of respecting soil and rain as gifts not to be taken for granted. These lessons influenced how farming was managed in later decades, with more attention to conservation and soil health. But for families living through it, lessons came second to survival. Each day was a question of endurance. Could they keep dust from smothering children's beds? Could they find enough food to last the week? Could they gather enough strength to keep moving forward on roads that seemed endless? Survival required not only strength, but also faith in tomorrow. Government programs eventually brought some relief. Soil conservation efforts taught farmers new methods, like contour plowing and planting windbreaks of trees. Dams and irrigation projects brought water to some areas, but for many families, the damage had already forced them to leave. The Dust Bowl scattered communities across the nation, sending pieces of the plains into every corner of America. Despite the hardship, resilience shone through. Families who resettled built new lives in unfamiliar places. They worked long hours in fields, slowly saving enough to rent small homes. Children who once lived in shacks of dust grew up in schools along the coast. Though poverty remained, the chance for stability gave hope. The Dust Bowl became more than a natural disaster. It was a human story of loss, migration, and endurance. It showed how economic crisis and environmental crisis could collide, creating layers of hardship that tested every part of life. Yet it also showed the unbreakable drive to keep moving forward, no matter how heavy the road. The Dust Bowl also shaped culture. Writers and photographers captured the struggles of migrant families, telling their stories to the rest of the country. John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath, painted a vivid picture of families leaving the dust for California, carrying hope as their only true possession. Photographs by Dorothea Lange, like the famous migrant mother, revealed faces etched with worry and strength. These stories and images gave voice to those who might otherwise have been forgotten. The Dust Bowl years remind us that survival is not only about money or work. It is also about the land we live on, the weather we depend on, and the choices we make with resources. When those forces collapse together, families face trials that feel impossible. But even in impossible moments, people adapt. As families settled into migrant camps, another challenge grew. Work in the fields was seasonal, pay was unfair, and living conditions were harsh. Families who had already lost everything were forced to fight for dignity once again. They had crossed deserts and mountains in search of relief, only to face new struggles in orchards and fields. That is where our story turns next. From the Dust Bowl to the orchards of California, migrant families faced fresh battles for fair pay and decent lives. Their voices would add to the growing call for justice in a time when survival still felt uncertain. Families who fled the Dust Bowl thought they had escaped the worst. They left behind choking storms and ruined farms, carrying only hope that California would bring relief. The orchards and fields looked green and abundant compared to the plains they had left. But survival in California came with its own trials. Work in the fields was available, but not steady. Jobs followed the seasons. Families picked peaches in summer, grapes in autumn, and cotton when the weather cooled. When the harvest ended, so did the pay. This meant constant movement. Migrant families traveled from farm to farm, packing belongings each time, sleeping in tents, and hoping for the next chance to earn. Wages were low. Farmers often paid by the pound or the basket, not by the hour. Families worked long days under the sun, bending and lifting until their backs ached. Children joined parents in the fields, their hands red from fruit and their feet blistered from long hours. Even so, earnings barely covered food. Rent for even the poorest shacks drained what little was left. Migrant camps sprang up near orchards and farms. Some were run by growers, little more than crowded shacks with no clean water. Others were organized by the government, offering sanitation, schools, and medical care. In the better camps, families found dignity and safety, but spaces were limited. Many were forced to live in open fields or ditches, setting up tents made of canvas or patched quilts. Locals often looked at migrants with suspicion. Families who had lived in California for generations feared that newcomers would take jobs. Migrants were called names like Okies even when they came from other states besides Oklahoma. Children faced teasing in schools, and families faced barriers when trying to rent homes or buy supplies. The dream of welcome often turned into the sting of rejection. Despite hardship, families worked together to endure. Parents rose before sunrise to prepare small meals for the fields. Children carried younger siblings while older ones picked alongside adults. At night, families gathered around fires, singing songs, telling stories, and holding on to the comfort of being together. Even in exhaustion, hope remained alive in these small acts of connection. Some migrants organized to demand better wages and treatment. Strikes broke out in fields when workers realized pay was far below survival needs. These strikes were risky. Farmers sometimes responded with threats, violence, or by hiring strikebreakers. But the willingness to stand together showed that even in weakness, there was strength in unity. Government-run camps, like those created by the Resettlement Administration, became safe havens. These camps provided showers, kitchens, and schools. They were not luxurious, but they gave families dignity. They allowed children to attend classes, even for a short time, and gave parents a sense of stability. For many, these camps were the first step toward feeling human again after years of loss. Writers and photographers brought attention to these struggles. Dorothea Lange's photographs showed mothers with tired eyes holding children in their arms. John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath told the story of one migrant family, capturing both the hardship and the quiet resilience of those who traveled west. These works stirred sympathy across the country and pushed leaders to address the conditions. Daily life for migrants remained harsh. Food was often beans, bread, and whatever could be bought cheaply. Water was sometimes scarce. Illness spread quickly in crowded camps. Privacy was nearly impossible, yet families adapted. They made homes in tents, swept dirt floors, and taught their children lessons under the shade of trees. Survival meant creating stability in unstable places. Children growing up as migrants learned responsibility early. They worked in fields, cared for siblings, and helped manage what little money came in. Education often came second, interrupted by moves and seasons. Many of these children grew up with a sense of toughness shaped by years of sacrifice. They carried these lessons into adulthood, forever marked by the struggles of their childhood. The fight for fair work became larger than individual families. Unions and worker organizations began to rise, giving migrants a voice. They argued for fair wages, safe housing, and the right to organize. Though progress was slow and resistance was strong, these efforts planted seeds that would shape labor rights for years to come. The struggles of migrants revealed deep truths about money and dignity. Work alone is not enough if wages cannot support life. Shelter alone is not enough if it lacks safety. A society that depends on labor must also value the people who give it. These truths grew louder during the Depression and still echo in conversations about work today. Even in the hardest camps, joy was not absent. Families played music on guitars or harmonicas. Children laughed in the fields when work slowed. Neighbors shared what little they had, creating bonds that made hardship more bearable. In the middle of exhaustion, life still carried moments of light. For many, California was not the dream they hoped for, but it was still a place to survive. The soil grew crops, the orchards gave work, and even meager wages meant food for another day. The journey west was not the end of suffering, but it was the start of a new kind of endurance. The story of migrant families is a reminder of resilience. They had lost homes to dust, farms to debt, and trust to broken promises. Yet they continued forward. They bent their backs to fields, taught their children to endure, and built communities out of nothing. Their strength became part of the larger fabric of the Depression story. As these struggles unfolded in orchards and camps, another force was shaping the country. Beyond the farms and fields, industry and city life were also changing. Factories were adjusting to new rules. Banks were learning from reforms, and ordinary families were finding ways to survive with less. The Depression was not one story but many, woven together across fields, towns, and cities. That is where we turn next. From the orchards of California to the factories of the Midwest, the struggle for work and survival took many forms. Each story added to the larger lesson of the Depression, that money touches every part of life, and its absence reshapes everything. While migrant families bent their backs in fields, another struggle echoed through cities and towns. Factories that once promised steady wages had slowed, closed, or cut hours. The Great Depression reshaped not only farms but also the rhythm of industrial work. For many families, the loss of a factory paycheck meant the difference between stability and despair. Factories had once symbolized progress. They turned raw materials into goods, filled shelves with products, and provided jobs that supported entire neighborhoods. In the 1920s, the hum of machines seemed endless. But when the crash came and demand collapsed, assembly lines slowed to silence. Workers were sent home. Doors were locked. Families who had trusted in steady wages suddenly found themselves standing in unemployment lines. Those who kept their jobs often faced harsh changes. Wages were cut, hours stretched longer, and safety standards were ignored. Men and women labored in dim light, breathing dust and fumes, clinging to the hope that at least they still had work. The pride once found in steady employment shifted into quiet fear. Nobody knew if tomorrow would bring another layoff. Families in factory towns carried this fear together. When mills or plants closed, entire communities suffered. Shops lost customers, schools lost funding, homes fell empty as families left in search of work elsewhere. The ripple spread far beyond factory walls, showing how deeply industry shaped daily life. Yet out of this hardship, solidarity grew. Workers realized their voices carried more strength when joined together. Labor unions gained power, pressing for fair pay, safer conditions, and shorter hours. Strikes became a common tool, though they often came with risks. Companies hired strikebreakers, police clashed with workers, and tensions ran high. Still, each strike planted seeds of change. The Wagner Act of 1935 gave unions stronger rights, protecting workers who organized. This was a turning point. For the first time, the government recognized the right of workers to bargain collectively. It did not solve every problem, but it shifted the balance of power slightly, toward the laborer. Families who had once felt voiceless now held a measure of protection. Factories during the Depression revealed the delicate balance between profit and people. Owners sought to cut costs to survive, but cutting too much left workers unable to live. The struggle showed that industry could not function without human dignity. Machines alone could not sustain an economy. It was the people who mattered. Daily life for factory workers remained exhausting. Men worked long shifts with little rest. Women, often paid less, balanced factory jobs with caring for children at home. Teenagers took on shifts to support families, entering adulthood sooner than expected. Families counted every paycheck carefully, deciding between rent, food, and coal. Choices were limited, and sacrifices were constant. Even in these struggles, moments of hope appeared. Paydays, though smaller, meant food on the table. Neighbors shared meals when one family came up short. Children played in alleys after long days, creating joy from simple games. The Depression taught families that even in hardship, life continued and dignity could be found in small victories. The story of labor in the Depression was not only about loss, it was also about resilience and reform. Workers demanded recognition, and slowly they began to receive it. Unions became stronger. Labor laws were written. These changes shaped the future, ensuring that future generations would work under conditions more balanced and fair than those of the 1930s. The Depression also revealed the truth about security. A steady paycheck felt like safety, but when factories closed, that safety vanished. Families learned that real security was not found in companies alone, but in community, solidarity, and adaptability. These lessons lingered long after the Depression ended. Factories, like fields, showed the fragility of life during this era. When crops failed, farmers starved. When machines stopped, cities faltered. Yet both farmers and workers found strength in unity. They protested, they organized, and they endured. Their combined struggles became the foundation of reforms that reshaped the nation. Children who grew up in factory towns during the Depression remembered the silence of idle machines. They remembered fathers standing in unemployment lines and mothers stretching small meals across long weeks. These memories shaped how they viewed money, work, and security as adults. They carried caution, thrift, and a deep respect for steady employment into the rest of their lives. The Depression's lessons in labor still echo today. Work is not only about wages, but about dignity, safety, and fairness. The struggles of the 1930s remind us that progress often comes from the voices of workers who refuse to be silent. Their endurance became the foundation for labor rights we often take for granted now. Factories may have slowed, but they did not stop forever. Recovery came slowly, powered by reforms and resilience. By the late 1930s, industry began to stir again, preparing for another challenge that would soon reshape the world. But before that global shift arrived, families in the Depression still had to survive daily realities of scarcity, loss, and endurance. As we move deeper into the story, we turn now to those everyday sacrifices. Beyond fields and factories, families learned new ways to live with less. They built habits that became lifelong lessons in thrift, patience, and resilience. These daily practices of survival carried wisdom that still matters today. Factories slowed, farms struggled. Families across the nation learned a new way of living. They called it making do. It meant stretching every coin, reusing every scrap, and teaching children that nothing was too small to save. These habits became part of the culture of the Depression. They shaped a generation that would forever see waste as dangerous. Families cooked large pots of beans or soups that could be stretched for days. Leftovers were never thrown away. Bread, even stale, was soaked in milk or broth to make filling dishes. Fruit peels became jams. Bones were boiled for broth until no flavor remained. Eating was not about choice but about survival, and every bite was valued. Clothing followed the same rule. Old coats were repaired again and again. When shoes wore through, cardboard was placed inside to cover holes. Mothers sewed late into the night, turning scraps into quilts and repairing garments by lamplight. Clothing was not fashion, it was function. Homes reflected thrift as well. Nothing was wasted. Old jars became containers for nails, sugar, or buttons. Newspapers were used for insulation, wrapping, or even bedding. Soap slivers were melted together to form new bars. Families learned to live without extras. Furniture was repaired instead of replaced. Toys were made by hand, often from sticks, cloth, or whatever materials were on hand. They saw parents count coins carefully before buying even the simplest items. Many children worked small jobs, selling newspapers, shining shoes, or helping on farms. Their earnings, however small, went into the family budget. Childhood innocence was shortened, but responsibility grew strong. Families who once visited theaters now stayed home. Radio programs became the center of leisure, offering music, news, and stories. Board games like Monopoly, created during the Depression, became popular as families looked for cheap ways to pass the time. Neighbors gathered for simple pleasures like singing, storytelling, or shared meals. Joy was found not in spending, but in togetherness. These habits of thrift carried emotional weight. For many, saving became tied to security. A full pantry, no matter how plain, gave comfort. A small savings hidden in a jar meant relief. Families who lived through these years often carried thrift into their later lives. Even decades later, they hesitated to waste food or spend carelessly. The memory of scarcity stayed with them. Living with less also brought creativity. Families invented new recipes, new ways to repair items, and new methods to stretch resources. Communities shared tips and supported one another. Neighbors traded skills, a loaf of bread for a mended coat, or help with repairs for a small bag of flour. Thrift turned survival into shared effort. Government programs supported this spirit. WPA sewing rooms provided clothing for families in need. School lunch programs offered children at least one steady meal each day. These efforts did not remove hardship, but they gave a foundation of support that families could build upon with their own resourcefulness. It was also about patience and endurance. Families learned to wait, to go without, and to find peace in simplicity. Birthdays were celebrated with homemade cakes. Holidays were marked with small gifts made by hand. Even in scarcity, love was expressed through effort rather than expense. Families taught their children that money was fragile, that saving was important, and that gratitude was essential. Many adults who grew up in the 1930s carried lifelong habits of frugality, building savings accounts and avoiding debt whenever possible. Their caution became a legacy. People discovered that joy and dignity were not dependent on wealth. Families who had lost almost everything still found laughter, still shared meals, and still created memories. The Depression taught that life was not defined only by possessions, but by resilience, relationships, and hope. As the Depression wore on and global conflict began to rise, the habits of conserving, saving, and enduring became vital once more. The skills learned in kitchens and sewing rooms became strengths in a world that would soon demand even more sacrifice. Looking back, the lessons of thrift are not about hardship alone. They are about resilience, creativity, and the ability to adapt. They remind us that even in scarcity, people find ways to live, to care, and to thrive in small ways. These truths are timeless, offering wisdom even in modern struggles with money and security. As families counted coins and patched shoes, they also began to think about the future. Recovery seemed possible, but it was not yet certain. For many, the question remained: could these lessons of thrift lead to lasting security, or would the pain of the Depression remain forever? That is where our story now shifts. The final act of the Depression brought not only continued struggle, but also deep change. Families began to heal their relationship with money, government shaped stronger safety nets, and a nation prepared for the challenges that lay beyond. Years of scarcity left scars that could not be seen, but were deeply felt. The Depression had shown families how fragile money was, how quickly stability could vanish, and how heavy fear could become when paychecks disappeared. Healing from these wounds did not happen overnight. It required time, patience, and the steady rebuilding of trust in both money and life itself. For many, security no longer meant riches. It meant small guarantees, a pantry with enough food for the week, shoes that could last through the season, rent paid on time with no fear of eviction. These simple things, once taken for granted, became the definition of safety. Security was not measured by wealth, but by the absence of worry. Families began to redefine what mattered. They learned that survival was not only about having more, but about using what they had wisely. Money became a tool to protect against fear, not a symbol of status. Even when paychecks returned, people saved carefully, remembering the days when every coin counted. This healing showed itself in habits. Some kept gardens, even when food became easier to buy. They wanted the comfort of knowing they could grow their own if needed. Others stored jars of food, extra blankets, and supplies, not from greed, but from memory. The wounds of the Depression whispered that being prepared meant being safe. Community also became part of security. Families leaned on one another more openly. Neighbors shared meals, tools, and childcare. Churches and local groups built support systems that stretched beyond family ties. People learned that security could also be found in connection, in knowing that someone nearby would step in if hardship returned. For children, the healing was slower. Many had left school to work, carried responsibilities beyond their years, or watched parents struggle in silence. Their wounds were deep, tied to identity and worth. As adults, they worked hard to avoid debt, feared waste, and valued stability above all else. These values came from the lessons of pain, reshaping how they approached money throughout their lives. Healing also came through government programs that lasted beyond the Depression. Social Security offered a promise that aging would not mean abandonment. Labor laws gave workers rights that could not be stripped overnight. Banking reforms rebuilt trust that money deposited would not vanish in a storm of panic. These protections became part of the nation's foundation, stitching wounds with threads of stability. But healing was not only practical, it was emotional. Families had to let go of shame. The Depression had made many feel like failures, even when the collapse was far beyond their control. Letting go of that shame meant recognizing that survival itself was strength. Enduring had value. Persistence was worthy of respect. In this healing, money was no longer seen only as numbers. It was tied to feelings of safety, worth, and dignity. Families began to see that wealth was not simply about accumulation. It was about freedom from fear. It was about being able to rest without the weight of hunger or uncertainty pressing down. Redefining security also meant redefining dreams. Before the Depression, success was often measured by possessions, homes, and social standing. Afterward, success became simpler. A steady job, a safe home, and children who could attend school were enough. Families shifted their goals from excess to stability, from luxury to peace of mind. This change was quiet but powerful. It reshaped how people worked, saved, and planned. It also influenced future generations, teaching children that security mattered more than appearance, that caution mattered more than risk, and that peace mattered more than wealth. These values spread into households across the country, leaving a cultural imprint that lasted long after recovery. Even as wounds healed, fear never disappeared entirely. Many who lived through the Depression carried it with them for the rest of their lives. They worried when cupboards looked empty, even if money was in the bank. They hesitated before spending, even when they could afford to. The memory of loss remained a quiet shadow, reminding them how quickly life could change. Yet healing was not about erasing the past, it was about learning from it. The Depression taught that security could be built through saving, sharing, and protecting. It showed that dignity was not lost in asking for help, but in pretending problems did not exist. It revealed that even in the worst times, people could adapt, endure, and grow stronger. Families who redefined security also redefined wealth. Wealth was not only about possessions, it was about choices. It was about having enough stability to choose rest over endless work, to choose education for children, to choose food that nourished instead of food that only filled. These choices became the new measure of success. This healing phase marked the beginning of redesign. Out of hardship, families built new foundations for living. Out of wounds, they created wisdom. Out of fear, they created strength. And out of scarcity, they created gratitude for even the simplest blessings. As the nation shifted from recovery into resilience, one question remained. Could these new habits and definitions last? Or would the drive for more, the lure of risk, return once hardship faded? History suggests both were true, but in the moment, families were focused on one thing, never letting themselves fall so far again. And that is where our story now turns. Healing was personal, but it was also collective. Entire communities began to adopt new practices and rituals that gave peace, clarity, and structure to daily life. These rituals were not about numbers on a page. They were about restoring calm in the relationship between people and money. As wounds from the Depression slowly healed, families looked for routines that gave them peace. These daily and weekly habits became quiet rituals, small actions that restored a sense of control. After years when life felt unpredictable, these rituals provided rhythm. They turned fear into structure and gave people a way to feel calm about money again. One ritual was the budget meeting at the kitchen table. Parents spread out coins, envelopes, and bills under a single lamp. Together, they decided how each dollar would be spent. Rent went first, then food, then heat. If anything was left, it was tucked away for savings. These meetings became less about stress and more about teamwork. They reminded families that they were not facing hardship alone. Envelopes became powerful tools. Families divided money into categories and placed cash in separate envelopes labeled for groceries, rent, or clothing. When the envelope was empty, spending stopped. This simple method gave structure and prevented overspending. It also gave comfort. Families could see, touch, and count their money in a way that felt secure. Savings jars also became common. Even small amounts of change were dropped into jars on shelves or windowsills. Children were encouraged to add pennies from chores or small jobs. Watching the jar, Phil gave families a sense of progress. It was not about large sums, but about steady growth, a visible reminder that security was building slowly. Rituals extended to food as well. Families planned meals with purpose, stretching groceries across weeks. Sunday dinners became a symbol of abundance, even if the menu was simple. Sharing one bigger meal each week created joy and reminded families of stability. These food rituals turned scarcity into celebration, helping families see progress in their recovery. Gardens became rituals of resilience. Families planted vegetables in backyards or community plots. Gardening was more than work, it was therapy. Watching seeds grow into food gave comfort and hope. Harvests reduced grocery costs, but more importantly, they restored the feeling of providing directly for the family. Each tomato, each potato felt like proof that stability was possible. Record keeping also became a ritual. Families began writing down expenses, tracking every purchase in small notebooks. These books became more than numbers. they told the story of survival. Each entry showed choices, sacrifices, and persistence. Over time, notebooks revealed progress, giving families pride in how far they had come from the darkest years. These rituals shaped children's lives. They grew up watching parents count carefully, save intentionally, and plan patiently. They learned that money was not to be feared, but to be respected. They saw that even small habits could create peace. As adults, they carried these rituals forward, building lives rooted in the lessons of their parents' discipline. Community rituals also grew. Neighbors shared tips for saving, trading goods, and supporting each other. Church collections included food and clothing as often as money. Local groups organized co-ops to buy items in bulk and share the savings. These practices built bonds that made financial stress lighter. Security was not only about individual habits, but also about shared responsibility. Rituals helped with emotions too. They gave families moments to pause and breathe, sitting together to plan, saving a little each week, and celebrating small wins all reduced the weight of anxiety. Money no longer felt like an enemy. It became something that could be managed, step by step, with patience and intention. The return of calm was not instant. Worries still lingered. Memories of hunger and fear still whispered at night. But rituals softened those voices. They gave people reasons to believe in progress. They showed that life did not need to return to chaos. These practices turned hope into action, making peace something that could be built rather than wished for. The culture of money rituals also influenced larger society. Schools taught children about saving and thrift. Newspapers printed articles about household budgeting. Radio shows gave tips for stretching dollars. The idea that financial habits could bring security spread widely, shaping an entire generation's relationship with money. Over time, rituals became traditions. Families looked back at the hardest years and remembered not only struggle, but also the routines that carried them through. These traditions gave identity, shaping how families saw themselves and how they taught their children to live. Security became less about luck and more about practice. The Depression revealed that healing money wounds required more than relief programs. It required daily acts of patience, structure, and hope. These rituals did not erase pain, but they gave people the tools to move forward with less fear. They turned survival into stability, and slowly, stability into peace. Yet, the story was not finished. Rituals gave calm, but dreams were still waiting. Families had endured hunger, hardship, and shame. Now, with new habits in place, they began to think about more than survival. They began to ask, what dreams are worth chasing when survival is secure? Once the fear of hunger eased and the daily rituals of thrift gave rhythm, something began to stir again in families across the country. It was not fast, and it was not loud. It was quiet, almost shy at first. It was the return of dreaming. After years of only thinking about survival, people started to ask what else life could hold. Dreams had been forced into silence during the worst years of the Depression. There was no room to think about the future when the present carried empty cupboards and unpaid rent. But as the 1930s moved forward, families who had rebuilt a small sense of security began to let their imaginations breathe again. They allowed themselves to picture goals that went beyond bread and shelter. For some, the dream was education. Parents who had pulled children from school during hard years now fought to keep them in classrooms. They wanted their children to have choices they had lost. Education became a symbol of hope, a way to ensure the next generation would face fewer money wounds. Sending a child to school felt like planting seeds for a brighter tomorrow. For others, the dream was owning a home. The Depression had stolen homes from countless families, but the desire to own a safe place never faded. Families who managed to save even small amounts tucked those savings away with the hope of buying land or houses when the time was right. A home was more than shelter. It was a sign of stability, dignity, and belonging. Small businesses also represented reborn dreams. Some people who had lost factory jobs began to use their skills to create new paths. A carpenter might open a repair shop, a seamstress might sell clothing or quilts. These ventures were modest, but they symbolized independence. They showed that even in hard times, creativity could carve out opportunity. Dreams were not always material. For many, the dream was simply rest. They longed for evenings without the constant weight of fear. They wanted to laugh without guilt, to celebrate birthdays without worry, to look at their children and know tomorrow would not bring hunger. These emotional dreams mattered as much as financial ones. The courage to hope again was fragile. Families remembered too clearly how quickly life had collapsed before. Fear whispered that dreams could be taken away. But step by step, hope grew stronger. Each paycheck, each meal, each moment of calm made dreaming safer. Slowly, people allowed themselves to believe that the future could hold more than survival. Communities also began to dream together. Towns invested in small projects, repairing schools, building parks, or planting gardens. Churches planned events that brought joy instead of only relief. These collective dreams showed that recovery was not only about individuals, but about entire communities finding life again. Children carried the biggest dreams of all. They wanted to become teachers, doctors, writers, and leaders. Their imaginations were less burdened by the past and more open to the future. Parents encouraged these dreams, even when resources were thin, because they represented something larger than survival. They represented proof that the Depression would not define the rest of life. Hope also grew from the changes in society. Social security, labor laws, and banking reforms gave families confidence that some protections would remain. They believed the worst could not happen in the same way again. This trust in new systems allowed people to dream with less fear, to imagine futures that felt possible. Yet dreams were still humble. Vacations, new cars, or luxuries were not the focus. Instead, dreams centered on stability, education, and small improvements. This humility gave strength. Families knew that even small goals could transform lives. A new coat for winter, a steady job for a parent, or a child graduating high school became powerful symbols of progress. Dreams also shifted how people saw wealth. Before the Depression, wealth was often tied to excess. Afterward, wealth meant choices. The choice to rest instead of working 2 jobs. The choice to buy nourishing food instead of only cheap calories. The choice to send children to school. Wealth became less about show and more about security, peace, and freedom. The courage to dream again also revealed resilience. Families had endured years of loss, yet they still found the strength to imagine better days. This resilience became a hidden treasure of the Depression. It showed that no matter how heavy hardship had been, the human spirit could rise again, carrying hope even after being broken. Dreams were not without challenge. Many goals took years to reach. Some were never fully realized, but the act of dreaming itself was healing. It reminded families that they were more than survivors. They were builders, teachers, parents, and neighbors with futures to create. Dreams became a quiet rebellion against despair. The Depression taught that hope was not only possible, but necessary. It gave people energy to keep going, even when recovery felt slow. It gave children a reason to study, adults a reason to save, and communities a reason to rebuild. Hope turned endurance into vision, and survival into progress. And yet, as dreams returned, the world outside America was shifting. While families in the United States rebuilt lives, tensions grew overseas. Another challenge was rising, one that would soon pull the nation into a global conflict. Dreams born in the 1930s would soon face the tests of the 1940s. That is where our story turns next. From quiet rituals at home to the storm clouds gathering abroad, the Depression's lessons would carry into a new era. Families who had learned to endure would be called once more to adapt, sacrifice, and hope in ways they could not yet imagine. The 1930s had been years of endurance, rebuilding, and quiet hope. Families patched clothes, stretched meals, and saved coins in jars. They began to dream again, cautiously, as wounds from the Depression healed. Yet, even as they found small rhythms of peace, the world outside their doors was shifting. The whispers of war grew louder each year, and soon those whispers would reshape everything. Overseas, tensions built as nations struggled with their own crises. In Europe, dictators rose by feeding on fear and anger. In Asia, conflicts expanded across borders. At first, many Americans tried to look inward. They had faced enough trials at home, and the wounds of the Depression still felt fresh. But by the late 1930s, it became clear that isolation would not last. Factories that had once stood silent began to stir again. Orders increased for steel, weapons, and machinery. Men and women returned to assembly lines, finding jobs where none had existed just a few years before. Work that had vanished during the Depression now surged with new energy. For many families, this shift meant the return of steady paychecks and the first real sense of recovery. The mobilization for war ended unemployment in ways no policy alone had achieved. By the early 1940s, millions found work in factories, shipyards, and construction projects tied to defense. Women entered the workforce in greater numbers, taking jobs once reserved for men. They balanced labor with family life, becoming symbols of resilience and change. For families who had lived through scarcity, this sudden demand for labor felt like a release. Kitchens that had known hunger began to see fuller plates. Children wore shoes without holes. Savings accounts, once empty, began to hold weight again. The Depression had not ended in a single moment, but the war effort pulled the nation out of its long shadow. Yet the transformation was not without sacrifice. Families sent sons, brothers, and fathers into military service. The worry of hunger was replaced by the worry of war. Letters became lifelines, and rationing became a new ritual at home. Sugar, gasoline, and other goods were limited. Families who had mastered thrift during the Depression now applied those same skills to wartime sacrifice. The shift from Depression to war showed how quickly circumstances could change. Where once jobs were scarce, now labor was in high demand. Where once families longed for stability, now they carried both relief and fear. Security came with a price, reminding everyone that prosperity was never free of cost. The war years also reinforced lessons learned during the Depression. Saving, conserving, and sharing remained essential. Community ties strengthened as neighbors supported one another through rationing and worry. People knew how to endure because they had already endured before. The resilience built in the 1930s became the foundation for surviving the 1940s. Children who had grown up during the Depression now watched their parents navigate war with the same patience and determination. They saw that stability could be rebuilt even when the world shifted again. These experiences shaped a generation that valued both caution and courage, thrift and ambition, community and independence. The transformation of the nation was visible everywhere. Cities buzzed with industry. Farms produced for soldiers abroad. Women organized scrap drives, planted victory gardens, and filled factories. Even as families carried fear, they also carried pride. The sense of purpose brought by the war effort replaced the despair of the Depression. The Depression had taught people how to survive when there was little. The war taught them how to give even when they had more. These lessons were different but connected, shaping how families understood money, work, and sacrifice. Together, they prepared the nation for the challenges of both hardship and abundance. When historians later looked back, they saw how the Depression and the war formed two halves of a transformation. The first half taught restraint, thrift, and endurance. The second half taught production, unity, and ambition. Together, they created a generation that would carry lessons into every decision, from family life to national policy. The journey from Depression to war was not simple, but it was profound. It showed that even the deepest wounds could heal, that even the hardest lessons could prepare people for new trials, and that even despair could give way to resilience. Families who had once felt broken by loss now stood ready to face the world with courage. And yet, even as factories thrived and soldiers marched, a question lingered in quiet corners. What would happen when the war ended? Would prosperity last, or would the cycle of fear return? Could the lessons of the Depression protect against future collapse, or would memory fade? That question leads us to our final chapter. As the Depression gave way to war, and war gave way to new beginnings, families carried their stories forward. These stories became legacies, shaping not only their own futures, but also the values passed to generations that followed. The Great Depression ended as the war years reshaped the economy, but its imprint never faded. Families who lived through those years carried the memory for the rest of their lives. Even when kitchens grew fuller and jobs became plentiful, the lessons of scarcity remained close. The Depression became not only history, but identity. One legacy was thrift. People who endured the 1930s learned to save, conserve, and stretch. They rarely wasted food, kept clothing for years, and often grew gardens even in times of plenty. To them, waste felt dangerous, as if throwing something away invited future hunger. These habits became daily routines that shaped households for decades. Another legacy was caution with money. Many avoided debt unless absolutely necessary, saved small amounts regularly, even when income was steady. Banks regained trust after reforms, but people still kept hidden jars of coins or emergency supplies. The fear of losing everything again never disappeared completely. Caution became a quiet form of protection. Community bonds were also a legacy. Families remembered neighbors who shared bread, strangers who offered work, and churches that gave shelter. The Depression taught that survival was often collective, not individual. These lessons influenced how communities supported one another during later hardships, from wars to recessions. The value of connection was carried forward. Children who grew up in the Depression were deeply shaped. They had known hunger, patched clothes, and parents' quiet fears. As adults, they worked hard to provide stability for their families. They often prized steady jobs, education, and homeownership. Their values were built on the desire to give their children the security they had missed. The Depression also reshaped how Americans saw government. Programs like Social Security, unemployment insurance, and labor protections became trusted safeguards. These reforms created a new sense of safety net, one that people expected to remain. The idea that government had a role in protecting citizens during crises became a lasting legacy of the era. Culturally, the Depression left marks too. Music, art, and literature from those years reflected both struggle and resilience. Songs about hard times, photographs of migrant mothers, and novels about families on the move all became part of the American story. These works reminded future generations of the costs of collapse and the strength found in endurance. Another legacy was resilience itself. Families learned that even in the worst years, they could adapt, endure, and recover. This resilience became a source of pride. It shaped the greatest generation, who carried lessons of thrift and sacrifice into the challenges of World War II and beyond. The ability to endure became a defining trait. The Depression also influenced ideas of wealth. Success was no longer measured only by luxury. For many, wealth meant stability, food on the table, and children in school. Prosperity became less about appearance and more about security. These values shifted cultural views, leaving a more grounded sense of what it meant to live well. The scars of the Depression also carried forward. Some people never shook their fear of scarcity. They stockpiled goods even when stores were full. They worried about every purchase, fearing another collapse. These scars shaped personal choices, sometimes creating caution so deep it limited risk-taking, even in safe times. Yet the legacy was not only fear, it was also gratitude. Families appreciated small joys more deeply. A simple meal, a paid rent bill, or a warm coat in winter felt precious. Gratitude for stability became part of everyday life. It reminded people that even ordinary moments were worth celebrating. Generations that followed inherited these legacies. Children of Depression survivors often grew up with stories of sacrifice. They were taught to value savings, education, and security. They learned caution in spending and respect for work. These values influenced how they built their own futures, shaping culture long after the Depression ended. The Depression also left a legacy for policy and planning. Leaders who saw the collapse worked to create systems that would prevent another. Banking reforms, safety nets, and stronger labor laws all came from this period. These changes did not eliminate future recessions, but they helped cushion their impact, proving that lessons had been learned. On a personal level, the Depression left families with stories. Around dinner tables, grandparents told children about breadlines, patched shoes, and gardens that kept them alive. These stories became part of family history, reminders of both hardship and resilience. They connected generations, passing down wisdom about survival, gratitude, and endurance. The Depression's legacies also shaped America's identity. The nation saw itself as capable of overcoming enormous hardship. It saw resilience as a defining strength. It learned that while prosperity could vanish, endurance could rebuild. This identity influenced how Americans approached future challenges, carrying confidence that survival was always possible. As years passed, the Depression faded from immediate memory, but not from its lessons. It became a chapter in history books, but its impact remained in daily habits, family traditions, and cultural values. It was a reminder that hardship could be survived, that resilience could grow from scarcity, and that security must never be taken for granted. The Great Depression was more than an economic event. It was a transformation. It reshaped how families saw money, how communities supported each other, and how the nation protected its people. Its legacies remain visible even today in habits of thrift, systems of security, and the deep respect for resilience passed across generations. And yet, as the story of the Depression ends, a question lingers gently. How do we carry these lessons forward into our own lives? How do we honor the resilience of those before us while building peace with our own relationship to money today? That is where we turn now to reflect softly on what the Depression teaches us about fear, hope, and the calm we can build in our own lives. The story of the Great Depression is not only numbers on a page or events in history books, it is the story of families who endured hunger, who learned thrift, who redefined what security meant, and who found ways to hope again. It is the story of resilience written in quiet kitchens, in crowded breadlines, in fields of dust, and in factories that fell silent. You have walked through this story tonight, chapter by chapter, slowly and softly. You have heard how lives were shaped by loss, and how dignity was reshaped by endurance. The Depression was hard, but within its hardship, people discovered truths about themselves, about money, and about community that remain powerful even now. The first truth was about fragility. Families learned how quickly wealth could vanish, how even banks and factories could collapse in an instant. But they also learned that fragility was not the end. Survival was possible, even in the face of fear. This memory shaped habits of thrift, savings, and gratitude that stayed for lifetimes. The second truth was about connection. People discovered that survival was lighter when shared. Neighbors offered food, communities built support, and families leaned on one another. The Depression showed that security was not only about money, but also about relationships. True wealth could be measured in kindness and in trust. The third truth was about resilience. Even after years of hunger, shame, and scarcity, dreams returned. Families found courage to hope, to rebuild, to imagine a better tomorrow. Children carried those dreams into adulthood, shaping new values of caution, stability, and peace. The Depression revealed that resilience was not born from abundance, but from endurance. These truths became legacies. They passed from one generation to the next, shaping how people saved, spent, and lived. They reminded families to value stability, to respect work, and to appreciate small joys. Even decades later, the lessons remained, guiding choices quietly but firmly. As you rest tonight, think about these lessons as gentle companions. They are not heavy or demanding. They are simple reminders. Save a little when you can. Appreciate the meals on your table. Value the people who support you. These small habits carry the same wisdom that helped families through the hardest years of the Depression. You might feel financial stress in your own life. You might worry about debt, about jobs, about savings. These worries are real. But remember the people who came before you. They endured far more, and they found ways to heal, to grow, and to live fully again. Their story reminds you that even in times of fear, you are capable of resilience. Let yourself release the pressure of perfection. The families of the Depression did not have perfect plans. They made do with what they had. They celebrated small victories. They found peace in thrift and strength in patience. You too can build calm with small steps, steady choices, and gentle self-compassion. As you drift toward sleep, picture the quiet rituals that gave families peace. Coins placed in envelopes, gardens growing behind houses, quilts stitched from scraps, radios playing softly in living rooms. These images remind you that security is built not from sudden abundance, but from steady, thoughtful habits. The Depression also teaches you that dreams can survive even after hardship. Families who once feared hunger still found courage to dream of homes, of education, of better lives for their children. You too can hold your own dreams gently. You do not need to rush. You can nurture them slowly, allowing them to grow with patience. And so the story of the Great Depression becomes more than history. It becomes a meditation on endurance, on community, on the meaning of wealth and security. It whispers that money is fragile, but people are strong. It reminds you that stability comes not from excess, but from gratitude, thrift, and connection. Tonight, as you rest, allow yourself to carry only what is light. Let go of heavy worries, knowing that tomorrow can bring small steps of progress. Let the lessons of resilience soothe you. Let the memory of thrift remind you that even small actions matter. Let the courage of dreams give you hope. You have walked through hardship in this story, but you have also walked through healing. Now it is time to rest, to close your eyes, and to let peace settle in. You are safe. You are learning. You are growing, and you are allowed to rest without fear. The Great Depression ended long ago, but its lessons remain. They remain in thrift, in gratitude, in resilience, and in the simple truth that people can endure and rebuild. As you sleep, let these lessons weave into your dreams, soft and calming, reminding you that tomorrow holds possibilities. So breathe slowly, let your body relax, let your thoughts soften. Tonight, you are not alone with your worries. You are part of a story of resilience, a story that has already shown how much strength lives inside ordinary people. And that strength lives in you too. Rest now. You have listened, you have learned, and you have let history become comfort. Tomorrow, you will wake with a little more calm. Tomorrow, you will know that your own money story, like theirs, can be shaped gently, patiently, and with hope.